Welcome, everybody, to the Tulsa.net user group. Tonight, Gaines Kergosien talking about the 7 habits of highly successful developers. Gaines, it's great to have you here. I have seen this talk before, and I'm excited that you're here doing this talk here at the user group. I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself. Do a far better job than I would, so take it from here.
Thanks, Sean. Excited to be here. My name is Gaines Kergosien. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. Work with Trailhead Technology Partners. We do custom solutions development, run by a bunch of geeks who are also conference speakers and architects. And so it's a lot of fun working together and building stuff. So this is one of my less technical talks, but I think it's really one of the ones that developers don't give enough intentional thought to about how to quantify the value they bring and market themselves with a brand and be more intentional about their career growth. And we can also geek out a bit about habit hacking and what that looks like. So I think it's a lot of fun. And I expect there'll be a lot of things in here that the attendees are familiar with. They're not going to be like revelatory, but hopefully maybe you get some new insights and think about them in a different way. And as Sean mentioned in chat, if you have any questions, you are welcome to unmute and speak up. You can also put them in chat, and Sean can find a good moment to let me know if I don't happen to see those. So with that said, let's just jump into it. I've also included a link. You might not need the QR code if you're at a computer. You can just type meet.kergosien.net. That's my last name to be able to book some time with me. You can book some time on my calendar to follow up on something about the presentation, or if you're interested in connecting with me about Trailhead technology and what we do and the kind of solutions we offer, they support my speaking when I travel to conferences, and so I'm always a big fan of getting the word out about what we can offer. So jumping right into the topic, I don't know how familiar y'all are with habits. I mean, everybody uses them every day, pretty much all day. But unless you've maybe read a book about them or went to some class where you discuss them, they're not generally a topic of conversation unless you're talking about bad habits, like trying to quit smoking, which you might have heard some tips there. But I like to start off by going over the very basics of habits, like because when you're talking about habitual behaviors, it really comes the key there is the cue that kicks that off, right? Which we think of, say, with smoking. Well, I love smoking. I have a craving, but oftentimes there's something, and people will identify these in themselves. Like maybe when I have a really great steak and a drink, like drink some alcohol, I really want to smoke. Or maybe you find a certain time of day at work, you get the munchies and you really want to hit that vending machine for a candy bar. So identifying the cues that trigger these behaviors, that trigger cravings or the desire to do these habits, whether you're conscious of those or not, is a major factor. So if you're interested in hacking existing habits, one of the best ways is to start logging, like when you realize you're doing something or having that urge to do something, what's going on around you, what time of day is it? Basically, you're being a detective. You're trying to note clues and find trends in what's going on. Of course, this can also be helpful when you're trying to construct new habits to decide what kind of cue am I going to use. And then, of course, the objective here, or sometimes the thing we're trying to avoid, is that reward. What's causing us to want to come back and repeat these habits that are building that loop into our subconscious. So there are a lot of ways that you can try to hack habits with rewards. Substitution's the most common. Maybe instead of smoking a cigarette, I'm going to chew some gum because it's like having something going on in my mouth. Maybe getting up at work and walking around, you might find is less about wanting something sweet or even wanting a snack as like wanting to socialize at that point of the day. Maybe you're dragging and just getting up and walking across the office gives you an opportunity for a change of scene. So figuring out what the reward is or should be is the other end of that habit loop. And then, of course, what we're trying to address generally is what happens in the middle, the routine that we're executing. So in the context of this talk, we're going to try to identify what sort of routines we want to start building into our daily, weekly lives in order to be more successful in our careers, be more intentional about the things that have to happen in the background along the way so that when opportunities arise or to make opportunities arise, we can seize them. So as I mentioned, you can start journaling if you want to be able to either track existing habits or develop new ones. And the key elements there are what kind of cue are you going to use? Like let's say you want to make sure that you go through your mail, it stacks up and you just don't ever want to deal with it or you think about it. And so you say, well, I'm going to break this down. We'll talk about techniques like this, break this down into smaller chunks. Maybe the cue is every morning when I sit down at my desk, if you're, say, working from home, I'm always going to go through a couple pieces of mail. So sitting down at my desk is that cue that I'm going to get in that habit of anytime this happens, I know that this is the next thing on my agenda. And then, of course, what routine do you want to build in or change in the middle of it? And then what kind of reward is going to keep me coming back? And that could be something artificial, like will I give myself a piece of candy? Or it could be the sense of accomplishment, like something checking a box, right? Sometimes checking things off the list give you that dopamine hit of like, I feel like I've accomplished it now that I've put that check mark there. So any questions at this point on habits? I mean, that was a very high level overview. Shouldn't all mornings routines start with coffee? Well, that would be a great, possibly a cue and a reward. Like maybe when you get your coffee, you tie that to whatever you need to be doing while you sip it, and then having that coffee while you do it is the reward. That'd be excellent. Um, there's a great book on this topic if you're interested in digging into it more called The Power of Habit. It's very anecdotal. It talks about scenarios where people have brain damage to different parts of their brain. Like one example, the damage prevented them from making habits and how difficult their life became because so much of what we do relies on habitual behaviors and how exhausting it can be to have to actually make these constant decisions about like, what do I do first in the morning? Do I brush my teeth before I, wash my face or whatever things need to go on? Another example was somebody who had lost their ability to make memories, but it was amazing the things that they could still do because they were habitual, even though they couldn't tell you where their kitchen was, but if they were hungry, they could go make a sandwich. It's fascinating. So moving on to the meat of this topic, the first habit we'll talk about is knowing the market. Because if you don't know what's out there and what you're worth, then it's going to be difficult to drive your career from that perspective. Now, when I do this as a workshop, one of the things I love to do is have a sharing of salary information. Now, that could be ranges, it could be anonymous. The point here isn't to make anybody put themselves out there in an uncomfortable way, but employers know what people are making salary-wise. Recruiters have a really good sense of what the salaries are in the market. The only people that seem to be discouraged from discussing this topic tend to be the individual contributors, those who are being hired. So I think it's important to not only know what skills are in demand. So here's like a chart with some of the more high demand skills. This is from IEEE.org, top programming languages. And this particular graph isn't from this year, but I don't think the trends have changed too much since this one came up. Oh, and by the way, these slides are available online. So, and I can post them in the files for this meetup as well. So don't worry about like taking screenshots or writing things down if you just want to pull it in the slides later. So based on the skills and how marketable, how in demand they are, and how many years of experience, or we have all these different kind of easy benchmarks. Years of experience is probably the most common, but maybe there are some certifications or some sort of milestones that you can point to that help to categorize like which salary band you fall into. And then, of course, there's also regional discrepancies. This is kind of interesting because you can see from one year to the next how different they were. This was from 2021. And you can see how much higher, the darker the color, the higher the cost of living, but also the higher the wages. So you can see the West Coast and the Northeast are very dark compared to a lot of the middle of the country. And then you can see it transition as we move into the next year, 2022, how everything seems to even out a lot more as we moved more to a distributed workforce and remote work. In fact, going back to the previous year, you can see some states that got much darker. Montana out there, Pennsylvania went from being very light to very dark. Georgia and Alabama, it seems the cost of living and the wages went up. So these are all factors. Of course, there are calculators online that you can use to convert from one to the other. So if we have time at the end, or maybe after we wrap up and we just go to chat, we could talk about some of those dynamics. But that's not the meat of this discussion. Really, the meat of it is how do we build these into habits? So does anybody have any ideas for how you can make awareness of what skills are in demand and what the market rates are for them and what like the different regional or location markets look like, that awareness into habits? I mean, the obvious one would be talking with people about it, I think, maybe making it part of the sort of things that you bring up in discussion. I'm just curious, what have you been seeing lately in the trends going on in the industry? Going to sessions like this is pretty good insight, I think. The things that get presented at these user groups and discussed tend to be ones that are in demand, maybe emerging technologies or just ones that are widely adopted enough that uh, they people want to hear about them.
I'd say talking with recruiters that have been in the industry for a while, they're going to have a much better feel for the pulse on the industries, as well as the newsline buzzwords like AI and prompt generation, things like that. So it still you still get the buzzword side of things, but then 6 months later, a year later, it's like, okay, what are people doing about this? And is there something actual tangible there with this new buzzword that's hit? Right. So, but yeah, like your point is just talking to others about it. Maybe even find somebody that, oh, they have that job in doing AI or, and specifically this new thing coming out, and go talk with them. And well, how do you like it? Is it exactly what you thought it was going to be? Or are you still bleeding edge technology and you are the one bleeding, right? And, is there too much pain point in that? So to your point, I think, yeah, discussing it with others and finding out who you can talk to with it.
And great point about recruiters too. I'm not sure what the dynamic would be in a virtual meeting like this, but I remember back when we'd meet in person for meetups most of the time, the recruiters that came out to those events and stuck around, they didn't just come to shake hands and then duck out at the beginning of the presentation, but they heard the buzzwords, they got familiar with the technology. They were the ones that I became friends with, and so just by being closer to them and communicating with them regularly, I got a lot more of that insight. And I know a lot of the people that I work with, they get pinged by people online about opportunities, like through LinkedIn, for instance. So that can be a trigger to instead of responding with "I'm not interested," saying, "Well, you're a resource and you're interested in talking to me. Let me mine you for some information."
Yeah, that's a good point. And before the pandemic, I invited multiple recruiters to come and sit in, and they said, you don't have to learn to become a developer, but if you learn how we think and learn how we struggle with various things, and as we're learning various topics and learn a little bit more about our industry, you're going to learn more about us. And then you got developers, anybody else in the room that's going to see that recruiter has been here every single meeting. I'm going to trust them versus the person that barely remembers my name.
Yeah, they're obviously not throwing resumes against a wall to see what sticks if they're investing that time in the community.
Exactly.
By the way, for anybody who isn't familiar, because I've recently realized this, that picture is of a nun, and what a nun wears is called a habit. So just in case there's a confusion, like, why is there this thing with a cross on it? It's supposed to be, so the second habit we'll talk about is specifically assessing your skills, because we've all got some special something that makes us valuable or marketable. Now, whether you're a very specialized skill set or more broadly like a more jack of all trades, will very heavily depend on both your value and your marketability, right? How hard is it to find that position, and how specific or high the compensation is. So one of the things that I try to focus on is, what do you want to be? Like, as Sean mentioned, find people who are in the position you want to be in, or who are doing the things that you want to do, to figure out how it maps from the things you're doing now, the skills you've already acquired, to where you want to be, so that you know what value is important for that narrative and that journey that you're wanting to build, rather than just saying, well, I've done mostly this, so that's my value, so that's what I need to do more. Now, as for measuring success, this is, I think, where a lot of people get the most value out of this conversation, because it's easy to say, I built a website that sells products and the company made this much money because that website exists. Therefore, I delivered that much value. I mean, it seems like the obvious scenario. But frankly, what a lot of us do more often is create efficiency, right? We make work that the company already does or needs to do more easier to do or less time consuming. So how many times have you built something where somebody used to spend, say, a week out of every month doing a task, and you built a solution that now they can do it in a day instead of a week? So you've essentially saved a portion of that person's time so that they can spend that on other things. And if you have a sense for what their salary might be, you can actually determine the approximate dollar value that you created there. Like now they either don't need one of their 10 employees anymore to do this, they can move them on to something else, or so maybe half of somebody's time could be spent on something else. But I think the most overlooked one is decreasing or addressing risk. Think about a disaster recovery scenario where if a company's website goes down, they're going to be losing huge amounts of money every minute that that site is down or every hour. Um, if you build a disaster recovery scenario where if that hosting service goes down, you can easily stand it right back up, or maybe it automatically gets stood up somewhere else. It may never get used. So on its surface, you didn't create value. You just cost the company money and they got nothing out of it. But what would it have cost them if they needed to use it? Now, as we've talked about these different measurements, it gets a little bit more nebulous. You might say, like, well, how do I know exactly what number to put on this? And I'd focus more on the narrative of how did you come to that number? Like, how did you justify the value that you said you brought? Because as long as you can explain that, I think it's less important that somebody else would arrive at the same exact number. It's more that that's a conversation point. And the fact that you're even paying attention to that, the value you're delivering is a differentiator by itself. And of course, we want to tie this back to those basic things of what technologies did you use? What role did you play in delivering this value? Of course, outside of the technical skills and the solutions that you delivered, we want to tie that back to the non-technical skills and value you bring as well. Everybody here probably has or above average communication skills. I'm going to guess. I mean, developers get a bad rap, right, for being introverts and nerds who can't really socially communicate. But whether you feel comfortable at a party or not is really not as relevant in your work life as whether you can talk about requirements and understand what the business is trying to convey. And if you haven't worked with anybody who comes from a different culture and who may have language barriers, you may not realize just how much value that alone can bring to the scenario, the situation you're in. Of course, a lot of companies will focus during interviews on your ability to collaborate with others, which then kind of goes along with your ability to adapt to an environment and grow. That narrative of, well, I've done a lot of different things. I'm not a specialist in any one of them. Could also be flipped to I quickly adapt to the scenario that I'm in and the need I need to meet, and I can pick up new technologies and skills as they're needed. So focusing on the collaboration, the way that you were able to work with others, the way that you adapt to the situation, the way that you're able to focus on solving problems rather than just executing on tasks. Because it's a lot easier these days to hire somebody cheap to execute a specific task. It's a lot harder to find somebody who can think about a problem, use critical thinking and critical observation, which is, let's say they give you a report to generate, and they say this is what the report should show. To ask the questions of, well, what are we trying to accomplish? What audience is this report for? What are we trying to convey to them? What kind of decisions are going to be made on this information? Because how often do we have insight into possibilities that the person asking for the work doesn't? Like maybe we know about some additional data that could be valuable, or maybe what they're asking for actually isn't going to show what they think it is. That it's going to be misleading, and they're going to find that out later. And nobody's going to come back down on us. We would have done what we were told to do. But it sets you apart when you can think critically about the work that you're doing and tie that back into the business value that you're delivering. And then along with that teamwork and a lot of these other things is how do you address conflict? When you're working with somebody difficult, when you've got somebody who isn't giving you what you need, maybe you don't work under the same power structure, but you still need to get things from them. You still need to work with them. So all of these things by themselves may be really hard to quantify, but I encourage you to start thinking about this as more of a narrative of what did I do? What kind of value did I deliver by doing that? What sort of challenges did I encounter along the way? And what ways did I overcome those? A lot of companies, but the big ones in particular, are now using the is it the STAR approach towards interview responses, where you say the situation that you were in, the task that you needed to accomplish, the action that you took, and the results that you got out of it. So that's one way you can think about structuring that narrative. Any questions about generally all these skills assessments and the value you've brought, and different kinds of technical and non-technical skills you've encountered and used along the way? Of course, we want to tie these back into habits. So this is one that is time sensitive critical, because if you get laid off from a job, it's going to be really hard at that point to go back and say, I know I don't work for you anymore, but I really need some insight into the value that my team provided when we did this work for you, right? When we delivered this product. Plus, you're missing out on a lot of the value that you can get out of those conversations. If you're the one developer in a department who's asking those questions, who's saying like, I know we had a successful launch. We had a little party for how great the launch went. We didn't have bugs, but a month or two later, like, how's that going? Is that working for users? Are they feeling pain? Like, we haven't really been seeing a lot of bugs come out of it, but what's the value it's delivering? That's a conversation that's generally you only hear from leaders, not so much on somebody we would consider like just a doer or an independent contributor. So especially if you're looking to move in more of those leadership type of roles, more responsibility, it's a great habit to get into. And then, of course, you're going to have to figure out what your own triggers are, or cues. Maybe you actually set reminders for yourself. Like every time we deliver something significant, I'm going to set a reminder for this long after to follow up and maybe send an email and say, how are things going? I just wanted to check in. It's kind of like training yourself in mindfulness.
An idea that you spurred actually is, if we as developers, maybe like once a month, spend a little bit of time to reflect. What were your challenges that you had over the previous weeks or days, whatever, and what did you do about that? What learning opportunities did you take on? What did you take on? Some Pluralsight videos, things like that. What were the things that you helped grow? What were the challenges that you conquered? Yeah, brag sheets. I like that. So if it's time to maybe you got to evaluate yourself, and you got to give that information to your boss, that can help sell you to why should you get a raise kind of thing. A brag sheet, I like that. And you will already have that, if you're already in this habit of doing the kind of that reflection of those kind of items like that.
Yeah, I love that. We'll talk a little bit about different tools for planning and organizing your work, but I used to keep a daily planner of paper that I write those sort of things down. And then when it was time for, say, a quarterly review, or an annual review, I'd go back and remind myself what I delivered. These days, I attend what we call L10 meetings, and at the beginning, we all talk about a best for my personal and our business life or professional life. And so I can look back at those L10 notes and say, well, here was the things I said I did well, or I accomplished, or that were highlights for me. It's a great point, Sean. And moving on to setting goals. So now you've established what the market demands, how your skills tie to those. You've got a narrative around how you've delivered value, because if you can show how you can bring a company in the right situation to hundreds of thousands of dollars of value, the question of whether you're worth $100,000, $200,000 maybe a lot easier for them just based on how many years of a skill you have. So now we want to decide, where do we want to end up, and we want to set some goals around how we're going to get there. So I'm not going to go too much into the topic of like SMART goals. You can look up techniques for setting goals online, but that's something for you to take note of if you're not familiar with how to break down goals. The main thing is that we're going to need to start setting habits about how we're going to make sure we do set our goals, and not just set goals like long-term measurable goals, but how do we break those down into the actions that we need to take to get closer to that goal? Because the truth is, if you do something towards a goal on a daily basis, you're going to get closer to that goal. If you don't try to do something on a regular basis, you're probably going to be like most of us, and you're going to get to the end of the month every month and go, yeah, I haven't made much progress on that. I really need to do that more. I'm going to be more intentional about that. But if you don't make it a habit or part of your routine, it doesn't tend to happen unless you've got something else driving you. So I am a big fan of planners like these, or if you've got a digital tool that you rely on, something where you can know I don't have to count my brain, particularly for those of us who are more neurodiverse and we don't remember things even if we want to remember them. Um, I personally love the, let's see, I don't think I have the brand noted in these slides. Um, and it slipped my mind, but I'll post the name of the brand with the slides. But these planners where they have a place to note what goals you're working forward to and what tasks you can break out. And you can even see on this one, there's a section for daily priorities where you can check off things that you've accomplished for that day as you identify them. So any other ideas about how y'all have managed to make goal setting and uh, actual execution of the steps that need to happen for you to reach those goals part of your daily or regular habits? Goals must be realistic and should be broken down into steps. A measurable goal is one way to track progress. I agree completely. I think a lot of companies encourage this through the way that they do reviews. Some companies have you set your own goals for the year, and they may even say we want some professional goals like within the business, like your role here, but we also want you to set some personal goals, like maybe something you want to get better at. And if they don't do that already, you could show some initiative and say, hey, I'm interested in doing this. I know it's not maybe company policy, but would you mind, whatever leader you report to or work with, meeting with me periodically and collaborating with me on this? Also, maybe a great way to end up with a mentor.
And I like what Ross put on here as well, is he uses Trello boards, which I know a lot of people do, and I like the Trello boards as well.
Yeah.
But also a wall calendar. That's one of those great things, depending on kind of where you put it. So if you have to see it every time you exit your office or your area, something like that, it's kind of that in your face reminder of any kind of things that you might have usually forgotten about. So it's a good way to keep an eye on your priorities as well.
Absolutely. Great suggestion. I'd overlooked that in the chat, so thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, I have used Kanban boards as well. Of course, you got to look at them. My wife would put a post-it note on my mirror in the morning, and I would go stand at the mirror, and somehow I would not see that post-it note right in front of me. So for some of us, it works better than others. So believe it or not, you are going to inherit a brand, whether you're intentional about it or not. And most of us as software developers, at least in the minds of people who don't consider themselves part of that community, there's a certain expectation of the kind of non-technical communication type of skills that we would have. So being more intentional about what brand you want to convey is something that can serve you really well to set yourself apart from the masses. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to convey a perfect image. You have to be some superhuman. I'm very big on genuine representation of yourself, not just because keep you from getting into trouble being called out for things that you boasted and couldn't back up, but I want to make sure that I'm set up for success in whatever I'm doing. So the more genuine I am about my capabilities, my interests, and what I want, how I want others to perceive me, the more that sets me up for opportunities where I can excel and even go beyond what's expected. So personally, my brand, I started off as a COBOL developer initially, but I didn't really even think of that as a brand at the time. But then I got into Microsoft Stack development, so I quickly became a .NET developer. In fact, my blog for a long time was named .NET Dude. I have since decoupled myself a bit from the specific technologies because I realized that what I love is less about the specific tech that I'm building with and more about solving problems. And the best problems that I tend to enjoy solving tend to be leadership oriented. Like, how do I make this team more effective? How to make their lives better and make them able to focus on the things they're good at and have to deal with the headaches and the things that they're not good at less. So, and in the brand that I was trying to build around doing that more, one thing I did was start a technical conference. I started Music City Code in Nashville in 2015. And besides the fact that there was a need for a local tech conference here in Nashville, my personal motivation was mostly that I had done a lot of consulting in leadership positions, but I hadn't been able to say, well, these many people have reported directly to me, like from an organizational perspective. I've hired and fired them. I've, had performance reviews. like all those things that like you think of a manager being responsible for as a consultant. You can lead a nationwide initiative and still nobody's reporting directly to you. So as a leader of a nonprofit community-driven event, I was able to say, well, I set a budget, we got a timeline, I put together a team. This team wasn't paid; they were all volunteers. And look at what we accomplished. It's very visible, very evident the value we brought. So if I could do that with volunteers who aren't getting paid, imagine what I can do for employees who are actually, full-time getting paid to do this. So that worked out really well for me to make that transition from an individual contributor consultancy role into leadership, like development manager positions. I also enjoyed it a lot. It was a great way to connect with people in the community. I'm sure Sean will attest that volunteering to lead or lead a meetup group or something like that not only is very rewarding and doesn't have to eat up a lot of your time, but also gives you like a role in the community and a reason for people to approach you and recognize you. So for those of us who are more introverted and don't naturally just capture the room's attention, it can be a great way to connect as well. I'm also a volunteer firefighter. That's not part of my professional brand as much, but sometimes that communicates a lot of traits of those non-technical skills, and especially if you're like, say, talking to a client who they consider themselves firefighters, like they've got mission critical situations, they've got a triage and understanding chain of command. And you'd be surprised how often these things that don't seem to tie directly into your professional life can fit in depending on the situation. Also enjoy cosplay. Used to do Dragon Con a lot. Built all sorts of fun get-ups, and sometimes that's a great way to connect with people. Sometimes when I present at conferences, I'll get dressed up for the session and maybe make it a little bit more fun. That's me in a Dr. Horrible get-up for a data science talk. Sean remembers that one, I think. So any questions about brand before we move on to ways to communicate your brand and get it out there?
So I like how you mentioned leader, because, and I've got to talk where I mentioned too, where it's more about not being the boss. It's not about having direct reports. You may be in a position where you are in the role of, like a leader. You may be in the role of senior dev. You may be in the role of an architect without the title. Things like that. It's a lot about what you do versus what title that you're tied to. And you can do a lot more than what your title says. You're more capable than that. So and a leader, I think, is a great one as well. And and I like how multifaceted you are as well on at different conferences and things like that, willing to wear costumes and such. And branding is, and I like how you mentioned too that there's a little bit of marketing, maybe a little professional side of the marketing, like how I want to have how I want to really represent myself. But you could also, it's easy to mess that up, where if you're in public and you're spouting off about a client and you're telling sensitive information, that doesn't look good. And you're hurting your own brand. So you got to be careful in that regard as well.
That's a great point. I tend to focus on the things you should do, but it's great to note that there are definitely some pitfalls to avoid, and learning those from the people who've been through it or hopefully they've seen others go through it. That's a great thing to keep in mind. I'm also a big fan. I don't personally blog a lot. I'm not a prolific writer, but there have been things that I was particularly proud of that I thought, hey, this is something that showcases my capabilities. Maybe I did something for a client, and of course I couldn't take that client's software, the code, and publish it publicly, but I could take the thing that I did and create like a little demo to showcase how I did that particular thing. So regardless of whether you think you have anything to say, chances are that the problems you're encountering, the error messages you're getting, the challenges that you're overcoming or struggling with are not unique to you. And so every problem you run into is an opportunity to share, not necessarily even a solution. Sometimes it's just about like having a discussion about it, saying, here's something that I was trying to overcome. Here's the solution I came up with. I don't think it's the best solution. I could see these problems with it. I want to improve it in this way. What do y'all think? What is a better way to go about this? Of course, now with ChatGPT, you could probably just ask it. But the idea here is also to engage other people and build that brand and help them understand what sort of things you're engaged in and interested in. And yes, how you think about and solve problems. Do you experience, and if so, how do you overcome imposter syndrome? Well, that could definitely be a whole hour talk just on its own. I think for anybody who isn't familiar, I think most of you probably are at this point, but the longer that you work in an industry, the more understanding you gain about all the things that you could do and learn about, the more you know you don't know. And knowing that you don't know all these things can often make you feel like you're an imposter, that you should know more of these things, especially when you're, say, speaking at events and you're seeing all these people who know so much more about you than all these topics. They seem almost untouchable. Like I would have to invest so much of my time just to even get close to the value they could bring there. And I think the best thing to do is going back to what we talked about earlier. What value have you delivered? Because if you have contributed in a meaningful way and you have delivered business value and you quantify that for the narrative you share with others, then you're also sharing that narrative with yourself about like, I may not know as much as these other people about this new like Blazor or some other technology, but I know I can deliver value. It's just a question of what tool set, what skills I need to do that. Anybody else have any points that I might have missed on that? One thing that I didn't really understand at the beginning of my career, and it's a little bit more touchy, kind of touches on Sean's point about things you could do to damage your brand, is I would suggest embracing controversial topics. Now, some of them are more sensitive than others, but things like whether it's better to use Angular or React, or one framework versus another, are generally kind of safe topics to engage in a instead of having to hedge your bets and be like, well, everything's okay in the certain circumstances. Be confident and be outgoing and say like, this is what I think, and I challenge you to change my mind and be more assertive about it, because you'd be surprised how much controversy raises people's awareness that you are a voice on that topic. And even if they don't agree with all the things you say, you at least have an opinion that you've put out there, rather than just kind of being a peacekeeper and saying, well, yeah, everybody's opinion is valid. So that might be one that y'all have different feelings about. I'd be interested in your perspective. But along with starting that discussion, and I mentioned asking for insights, asking for people's feedback can help balance out that assertive, more controversial side of you by saying, like, I don't know everything, and this is something specific that I would love insight from people who know more than me on. We might come back to this in a later point of the presentation, but I have actually been hired at positions specifically because I was the person who said, I don't know the answer to that question during interviews. And the last thing that they wanted was somebody who was going to fake it until it was too late, and then they find out that they couldn't deliver. They specifically wanted somebody who was willing to say, like, I don't have the answer, I don't know that. Now, I like following up with, but I can find out, or I'd like to get back with you because we can find answers. But soliciting feedback is another way of showing that sort of mentality of like, I don't have to be the person with the answer all the time. I could be the person who's going to collaborate with you. Public speaking is a little bit more near and dear to my heart, and it's not because I'm a natural speaker or entertainer. I don't really even love presenting, although it is a great way to connect with all of y'all. It's really, for me, it's more of an opportunity to both build a brand and get it out there, but connect with other people who I admire in so many different ways. And you know that saying about like you are the combination of, say, the 3-5 people you spend the most time around. Well, I try to spend as much time as I can around people who set my bar higher, who make me realize that I can achieve more. Or maybe I'm interested in having a really popular open source project like Jimmy Bogart, or I want to start my own company like some other entrepreneur that I've met at an event. So for me, speaking is a great way of doing that. And of course, it's not for everybody, but if you can tell a story, you can speak. You don't have to have some, like, I am not a expert on anything. There are things that I know a lot about, but I'm never going to be the guy, or at least so far, I have never been the guy who is the person on that topic. But I can tell a story, and hopefully a story that brings some value to you through what I'm sharing. A great way to start off doing this is open spaces or some sort of discussion forum. For anybody who isn't familiar, open spaces is where you have a list of topics that you want to discuss. People suggest them, the group votes on them. whichever ones get voted the highest, you have breakouts, and whoever wants to go talk about that can go join that group. And usually the person who suggested the topic leads the discussion, but they're not an authority on it. They're just saying like, hey, this is something I want to discuss with you. So it's very low barrier to entry. Lightning talks, we just had these at the Franklin.net or Franklin Developer Group a couple days ago. Generally, I really like the ones that can be on any topic, not necessarily technical. Some of the best lightning talks I've seen have been on like gardening or stuff that if you're passionate about it, you can easily spend 5 minutes. You'd be surprised how quickly 5 minutes flies by. And if you want to spice it up a little bit, you can do auto progressing slides, where every 15 seconds or however often it progresses to the next slide. But 5 minutes isn't a lot. Lunch and learns are a great way to take some of that pressure off, especially if you go to a session like this. This might not be the best one to bring back to your employer. I don't know, but you go to a conference and you see some technical talk, you can go back to your team and say, I'm no expert on this. I just saw a session, but what I saw was interesting. Let's grab lunch and I'll share what I learned with y'all. And then, of course, reaching out to people like Sean and saying, like, I've got a solution that I built that's really cool. I've got something I'm interested in. I've been geeking out on. Did a bunch of research so I can share that research with everybody. Again, you don't have to be the expert, but just having a story to tell, having some insight to share, you'd be surprised how often that makes you a speaker. And then if you do want to step up and start speaking at conferences where they'll maybe pay for your hotel room and maybe even help cover your flight to travel to a new city and check it out. And usually they treat you pretty well. They give you dinners and that sort of thing, give you drinks. Most conferences have a call for speakers. And so you want to watch their social media. Sessionize is a site that oftentimes conferences will post their calls on. And then you submit your ideas. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something you've spoken on in the past. It could be something you're just really interested in. You say, I feel like I know enough on this topic. I could research it. I could put together a talk. Let me put a suggestion, a submission out there and see if they bite, see if somebody wants it. And then usually have several months until the event to pull everything together, practice it, get to the point where you're comfortable with it. So I am running through my time without getting through this whole thing. So I'm going to start trying to speed it up. What's up, Sean?
Oh, you're fine. On your last slide, I was going to touch on a couple of points, and you're not behind at all. So don't worry on time. So regarding tell a story, I saw this clip and this guy giving advice at on a YouTube video. He was at a table and he was sharing his advice. And he goes, so many of us believe we don't have a story to tell. It's a common belief. I don't know what to say. I don't know what I don't have a story. He says, do this every day. Write down something that occurred to you that day. Now, at the end of a year, you will have guaranteed at least 15, 20 stories. And now if we turn this to be more on a technical focus, if we were to write down in a course of a month, what were the things that challenged you, and what did you grow from that, and what did you learn, etc. You're building a story right there. And as far as the imposter syndrome, we all have felt that. I have felt that so many times. I have fought it while speaking to a group of about 150 people and thinking any one of these people is going to get up and call me out and then run me off. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. When you do realize the people that are with you want you to succeed, and they're actually, and literally most of the people in the audience are more scared to be on stage than you're already conquering some timidness about speaking. That right there says a lot. And you're already conquering imposter syndrome. You're not alone. You can do this. Hit me up, hit Gaines, anybody. If you want to speak at conferences, speak at user groups, do lightning talks, things like that. We love helping others. Anybody, and I can vouch for Gaines as well. Being at a conference and somebody comes up, I got some questions, but I was afraid to ask during the session. What's your question? How can I help you? And how can I help you grow? don't worry about ever asking, during a talk, things like that. It's okay, right? We love helping people grow. And yes, as a user group leader, I always am open to having people that have never spoken before and want help. They want to try it. Let me know. I'm happy to help. So there's a few thoughts.
Joshua made a good point too about the effect you have on others when you're willing to admit that you don't know things, especially if you're in a position where you're speaking. Now, I wouldn't apologize and say like, I may not know everything on this, so don't hold it against me. Like, what they get is what they get. They don't know what to expect until they see your presentation. So I wouldn't apologize, but it is, it's valuable to the audience to see somebody in a position where they've already assumed you have authority, you're on stage, or you're up in front of the group, and you're still willing to say like, but I don't. You asked a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but tell you what, come up after the meeting. We'll get your contact info, and I'll let you know if I find a good answer to what you're asking.
And language helps too, because maybe you have an answer, but you're not as confident about it. You could start your answer with, well, here's what I understand about it. And you're simply taking your comprehension of the subject. And you're not saying like I'm the expert and I'm going to die on this hill with this perspective, so much as here's what I understand, but I'm very open to correction. Maybe you have another piece of the puzzle I don't have. And it goes back to certainly when we're at conferences and we've been around many people that are different political views, different lifestyle views, etc. And if you come in going, nope, I'm here to change everybody, you're probably going to get ran off. But if you come in with a conversation going, oh, I'm just here to learn more, I'm not trying to convince you, I'm just here to learn more about things like that, you don't you defuse so much of that controversy that way, and that now turns into a win-win because both people are learning from each other. So anyway, there's good opportunities there.
I'll take that great suggestion even one step further, that being in leadership positions taught me the power of questions over statements, because people take more ownership over solutions when they're part of coming up with it. So I may think I have a great solution, I may be pretty confident of it, but me just telling people, here's what I think, may not be as valuable to the team's success as saying, what do y'all think of this approach? Like, or maybe even take a step back from that and say, here's what we want to accomplish. Here are the things that we need to make sure get done and things to avoid. What do y'all think? How can we go about that? See if their solution, how it matches up with the kind of solution you were thinking about proposing. You can nudge them in the right direction, or you might find that they find a completely different path you hadn't considered. But either way, they're part of coming up with that solution, which can be incredibly powerful. Great discussion. I really enjoy that. Also don't want to keep you all around too late or cut into our drinks and discussions. So let's talk about how to make this a habit, because we talked a lot about building the brand. Blogging. I think the first thing to most things you want to achieve, whether they become habits or not, is just getting started. They say if you want to run on a regular basis, you want to become a runner, then make your goal putting on your running shoes and getting out the front door. What happens after that doesn't matter. You could take one step, you could take 100, but as long as you brought your shoes on, you stepped out the door, like you have accomplished that first step. And at that point, it might not seem as daunting. Like, well, I already got my shoes on, I'm already out here, I might as well run a little bit. If I start running, like this isn't so bad. I'm not a runner, so this is not talking about personal experience. But I think you could apply these to a lot of the things like blogging, like create a blog or go to LinkedIn. You can start blogging right there without even creating one, and just start noting ideas. Maybe start outlines. Like, you're not committed to publishing a blog on a certain timeline, but maybe as you start writing, you're like, man, I'm enjoying like talking about this thing, or I just need to get it down, and maybe I need to take a break and come back to it. Whatever dynamic works for you, but getting started. I love doing this in the workshop because this is where a lot of times we can get people doing actionable things that, like, actually there was a group that started a blog called Six-Figure Developer, because I used to give this talk as how to be a six-figure developer before I started speaking internationally, and six figures didn't translate well to other currencies. So they started a blog, the Six-Figure Developer, out of that workshop, and they're still doing it to this day. So it's like a very tangible outcome of just taking that first step. Any other ideas about how to build habits around this, like the cues? the rewards that would work for you, whether it's checking on speaking opportunities, uh, putting
I
content
know
out there.
just my 2 cents because I'm, I want to get some other habits as well. If nothing else, write down what your goals actually are, and maybe you start on two of them or just one of them, out of a list of maybe seven goals that you would like to do. Personal habit type thing, from quitting smoking, losing weight, walking, running, things like that. People like to brag about doing a 5K, and I'm like, I'll run 5 feet. I'll run 5 feet and I'm good for the year. And, I got a body of a sitter, not a runner. So um, I would say start there. Just write down what you want to do and then kind of break that apart and go put some shoes on, like you said, and just get out the door while you're there. For me, I like to walk. I'll walk with my dogs. Now I can walk and get a little more exercise and get off the chair for a bit.
Yeah. I don't focus too much on the rewards, but in the process of determining those goals, don't overlook like what's going to make me feel motivated to continue this. What even if it's not the end goal, like what things along the way are going to give me that dopamine, that encouragement to help build some of these habits. Great suggestions. So we talked about establishing a brand where you have a narrative about what you've accomplished and the value you've brought. You know what you want to achieve, and that's part of like how you've designed your brand is where do I want to go? How do I want to be seen? But connecting with people like the blogs and the speaking, like that's all kind of more people coming to you in some ways. Um, but how do you be more outgoing about those connections? LinkedIn is invaluable. Every time that I've ever been looking for a job, uh, I've always gone to LinkedIn, looked up the company, found people who work for them currently or used to work for them, ideally in the team that I'm looking to interview with. Uh, I often will invite people out to lunch. Um, I want to focus on not just like the obvious things of like say, well, I'm interviewing for your position, so what I need to know to be a good candidate, but what are you passionate about? What sort of pain have you experienced? Now, in the context of like a job opportunity, this can people remember how they felt more than what they did. So it can evoke those moments when they felt a certain way to be able to give insight that you wouldn't normally have gotten. But it also makes a really meaningful connection just as from person to person. I hate leading with the question like, "What do you do for a living?" I think that's one of the most common intro questions in the U.S. Not so much elsewhere in the world, but if they do what they're passionate about for a living, then asking them what they're passionate about could bring that up. But maybe what they want to connect with you on has nothing to do with the temporary position they're in until they find something better. And what better thing they might be looking for may be more valuable to talk to them about than what they're doing now. The same thing with the pain points, like what they're struggling with. Even if you can't be of any help, usually the most value that I've brought through connections is actually connecting them with other people. Like, oh, you're struggling with this Blazor implementation. I haven't been doing Blazor, but I certainly know people who have, and maybe I could connect you with them, and who knows what value could come out of it, but it's at least a channel that you wouldn't have had otherwise, maybe. And then, especially when you're at in-person events, be thinking about like, what do I want to get out of this long term? You're not even from a selfish perspective. It can be mutually beneficial, but a single introduction where you don't trade any information, you don't know how to contact them, you're leaving it up to chance as to whether you run into each other again. That's not going to have a lot of long lasting value. We'll talk about ways of like maintaining that connection, but being intentional about what long term outcomes do I want to come from this. Personally, I'm a big fan of feeding people. When I'm at events, I'm usually like I'm welcome to be a guinea pig. You're welcome to take me out and feed me and buy me drinks, and I'm happy to help you practice this. It doesn't work so well in this virtual setting, but there's a lot of psychological elements to providing people sustenance, to being part of a tribe that eats together. So don't underestimate the connection that creates. And those passions and pains and the things that come up over those meals, drilling specifically into the endeavors that they're working on. Once you've figured out like where those pains and passions lead you, can help to make that connection more tangible and lead to those like introductions and such. So as I mentioned, a lot of my opportunities to help people is in connection, but sometimes it's just asking the right questions, helping them think through something that they haven't been able to verbalize. They've been in their head about it. So being almost a therapist or counselor about it, where I don't necessarily have authority on the topic, but you do. You know what you're talking about. You're just having trouble thinking it through, and I can ask meaningful questions. That it often provides a lot of value. So some examples of like questions that I tend to enjoy asking um, in those sort of situations. Oops. And we mentioned LinkedIn. I guess I need to update these slides because it's not Twitter anymore, but there's Blue Sky. There's a lot about Mastodon, a lot of different platforms these days. So whatever network you find is useful, I'd love for y'all to throw some in the chats that you think, especially from a professional perspective, are most meaningful these days to connect with others. And then keep in mind that just because you put content on a social network doesn't mean that it has to be the same for everybody. I have a lot of professional connections on Facebook because some of them we have shared passions, board games, cosplay, other geeky stuff. Some of them we don't have a lot in common at all, but I can tailor the things that I think they'll be interested in. So I've got a Facebook group for IT or for speakers or for gaming, and so I can my grandmother may not care about the new version of .NET, but the IT folks that I'm connected to might. So a little bit of extra thoughtfulness and planning and how you're going to direct your content and where it should be channeled is very useful. So that's definitely falls in the category of habits for me, is like having created those user groups, and every time I'm posting, thinking about like, who do I want to be able to see this? And as a result, hopefully it creates a habit for them that when they see something from me, they know this is relevant. This isn't just like some professional connection wanting me to see pictures of their kids, and I don't really care about their kids. Anybody else have ideas for habits around making connections? Or networking, I guess, as we commonly call it. Well, it kind of transitions right into the next one, which is being your own salesperson. So I don't lead connections with trying to sell people on anything. I'm genuinely interested in better understanding them, but what their passions are, what their needs are. But in the end, uh, you've got this value narrative to share, so you need to figure out how to get it out there. There certain cues that when you connect with people in person are good opportunities to share these narratives that you've discovered. They're talking about building a solution in Blazor, and you've got some experience. It wasn't in Blazor, but it was somewhat related, and it might be of value to them. So you've already kind of developed this narrative around it, and those are your cues for when you want to share it. Or are you speaking at an event? Are you publicizing that? This is one that I've been bad about since the pandemic, is getting on social media and promoting, like, I'm excited to give this talk at the Tulsa .NET user group. And so I guess what I'm pointing out is you've done all this work up front of creating these narratives and getting this content out there. Now, how do we get the most mileage out of it? How do we make it pay off the most for ourselves? One obvious approach is to include it in your resume. Now, there are we could do a whole session on resumes, but I think there are some very obvious do's and don'ts. On the don't side, I would say keep it simple. Consider that the biggest barrier to your resume meaning anything is often some sort of machine learning algorithm or some sort of algorithm, whether it's machine learning or not, that weeds out candidates. So 200 people apply for a position, maybe only 20 of those actually get through the filter and get looked at by a real person. So all of your creativity may actually be working against you unless you're intentional about that. When I started off my career, for the first decade or so, my resume was a collection of skills. And that worked pretty well for finding my next programming gig. Well, we know you've been doing this for 10 years, so we are confident you could do that for us. It's not a bad approach, but it is pretty limiting, I think, especially if you want to be intentional about doing things that maybe aren't the core of what you've done in the past. So I've shifted to more of an abilities focused resume experience where I'm trying to deliver the most value I can at the top of the page because they may never get past that first sentence or that first paragraph. So I want to say, here's the thing you should know about me the most. Like, what position am I looking for? Like, how do I identify as a professional? What kind of value can I bring? Yeah, I think Gary was talking about the previous one, the functional resume, like the functions that you've done. So here I've got some core competencies, but they're more about the kinds of purpose that I can bring, or where I can deliver value. And then I go into the narrative. So this is where you can start leveraging some of those stories that you built about the value you've brought. What did you do while you were in that position? Um, any Again, we could go on for a whole hour or more about resumes and techniques, but any questions or thoughts about that before we move on to other representations of your brand?
So, if you think about, there's a filter, you don't know much about the filter. You just think there's going to be a filter applied. You don't know how to get your resume through that filter. Now we go back to communicating with recruiters to help better understand, how well should I prepare my resume? Does this resume really sell me in as a brand, right? And so when you be open to feedback, find the people you trust to give you that feedback. Be okay somebody telling you, sorry, it's junk, but here's a good a way to change this and make this better and help better sell you.
Yeah, excellent point. And there are services you can hire, or I was actually laid off from a company as part of a group of layoffs. And one of the benefits they gave was free one of these services where they paid for it to help you improve your resume and find a new position. Of course, you don't have to wait for a company to do that. You can either reach out to somebody you respect who has obvious experience in this, or you can hire a professional and they'll take what you've got and maybe put it in a different format or give you a template to put your things into. I don't focus on this as much since I think I've been around people a lot less for the past several years. But one thing that I found most developers overlooked in the past was their own personal business cards. I'm sure most of you, or a lot of you, have had company issued business cards. And how much value did those cards bring once you left that position? I mean, for you personally, that email probably didn't go anywhere anymore. The phone number probably didn't work. So I'm I'm not a big fan of go out and find a bunch of fun clip art and throw everything you can onto the card and make sure they have all the information they might ever need to reach out to you. I like keeping it simple. So for my approach, first of all, I want to spend some decent money and get a good quantity of good quality cards. So make sure that they're not something that's going to change in the near term. Things that aren't likely to change are your name, your email address, especially if you bought your own domain name. Like I'm Gaines at Kergosien.net. Doesn't have to be your real name. It could be a brand. There's a speaker, Phil Japixi is often known as Ski Medic, so he could easily use that as his brand. It doesn't really matter so much what you go with, as long as it's something that you own, you can be consistent with. But that can be both your email address and your website. And if you own that domain name, it's not going to change. So the website can have everything else. You might decide that certain things are more important for your industry or your position, but I'm a big fan of just putting the website URL, and then anything else they might want to need, you can always change that up on your site. And then, of course, phone number is a great way for them to reach you if it's more urgent or you need more back and forth than email. So to me, those are the most important elements, plus white space. So this was a card I used for years. You might not be able to see it in the slide, but there's an @ and a .net that are like a glossy, lighter gray. So at first glance, you see my name, you see my email address, and then on the back, I've got my phone number and the URL to my website. And mostly I've got white space so that when I do hand somebody this business card, I can pull a pin, which I keep a little tiny pin in my wallet just for this purpose. And I can write on there, met at DevUp, talked about machine learning, interested in connecting you with, one of my colleagues, whatever information might help them when they get home or finally get ready to put those pants in the washer and they find that card, like trigger their memory of like, oh yeah, that was the person I talked to. This is the reason why I want to reach out to them. Obviously, you want to take a more proactive role in reaching out as well. But I think this is a great way to represent yourself, and keep in mind that there are cultures, especially in the East, that business cards are a lot more meaningful than just a contact card that you can bump your phones and send it. Like they're a representation of you as a professional. So they may not be super valuable, you think, within the American culture, but be surprised when you start working with people overseas, the role it can play in those connections. And then we could spend a lot of time talking about interview tips, but the main thing is going back to the ways that you connect with people, whether it's on LinkedIn or other platforms, and understanding there is a reason why they have specific things that haven't worked in the past or that they know they need. And that's what the companies are really focused on when they're hiring. So figuring out which of your narratives fit those needs and those aversions. Like maybe they had somebody who was not a team player. They caused turmoil in their team. They caused more issues than they solved. Maybe they were a great producer, but they just messed up the team dynamic. Finding that out can let you know their sensitivity to where you can have a narrative ready about how you worked really well with the team and helped overcome some issues and help bring people together and proactively give them that insight that maybe they're not great interviewers and they're not going to ask the right questions to get that out, but you've made sure to address that concern. Or obviously, if they're looking to solve a particular problem, tying that back to a problem you've solved that gives them that confidence you could do it for them. Even if it's a different technology entirely, it could still be really valuable. Negotiation is an interesting topic. Hopefully, you now know the market. You know what you bring as far as both your skill set and the values. So you can set like some ideas of what you're worth. You've got a brand that conveys like, yes, I fit the role. Like maybe they're looking for a director of technology. What does a director of technology look like from a digital and personal brand? What do they appear? Do they show up in a t-shirt? Maybe for this company they do. Or maybe they're one of those companies that even the developers show up in button down. So what does a developer wear? It's not just digital. It's also like how you appear on camera or in person. And then finding that ability to, once you know the value you bring, you have that narrative ready, it's easy to balance that with those aspects of, I haven't learned that yet. I'm still working on improving that. That's something that I want to get better at, to show that you do have the humility to go with the things that you're bragging about. And just not being too ashamed to present your value and say that this is the minimum that I would be interested in for this position, or this is the range I'm looking at. Usually employers who actually want long-term employees or collaborators aren't looking to pay the minimum. Like they don't want to come in at the bottom end. So don't feel like providing a range necessarily means they're always going to go to the bottom end of that range. Sean says in interviews, he's asked, how do you describe the perfect candidate? Oh, ask the interviewee, like, what is the perfect candidate? That's a great question. I feel like I've more often done that afterwards when I get the no, and they say, we're not going to proceed with you. If we're going with somebody else, and I'd say, well, what would make me a better fit for this position if it comes up in the future, or because you'd be surprised how often that first choice didn't work out. Like they actually decided on a different role before they got back to them, or it turned out that they oversold themselves or whatever reason. But that's a good point of asking up front.
I have asked that during the interview, and sometimes it'll highlight something about the position that wasn't known up front. Maybe they're looking for something that will, can program all the websites in the world and fix the VCRs from flashing 12 type thing. And it's like if they bring up a subject that wasn't known up front, maybe that plays into the negotiation side of it as well. Like, yeah, I'm capable. I just didn't know that was required of me or of that position. So it could play in there as well.
Or just the enthusiasm of like, I haven't worked with that yet, but I'd be excited to get into that. And I alluded to this a moment ago, but always treat no as an opportunity, even if it's just an opportunity to learn, to figure out like, okay, I may never interview with this company again. This position may never come up again, but I'd like to know what made them choose somebody else, because I may interview for a very similar position somewhere else, and that knowledge may be key to making sure that I promote myself in a way that I do look like that ideal candidate. I also will do this with following up on if I feel like I bombed a question. Like, yeah, they asked me about this software development principle and I couldn't define it well at the time. Sending a follow-up email and saying, I was a little flustered, or whatever the reason was that I couldn't answer it right away, I went back and I reviewed it, and here's what I found. It's showing that I can go find an answer. It's not about whether I have it in the moment you ask me necessarily. I think the most important one, which we'll get a little bit more into before we wrap this up, is not fearing change, because so many of us can get comfortable where we're at, and especially with inflation, salaries are not keeping up. So I don't want this to seem like you have to go out and leave your current position to find something new. It could be negotiating within your own organization, just saying like, look at the value that I brought here. I'm worth more than I'm taking home. Especially if you're doing what Sean suggested, which is going beyond your role. Like, I'm leading, even though I'm a senior software developer, I'm providing this team leadership. I'm doing architecture. Like, I may not care about the title, or maybe I do, but I certainly care about the salary. That's why I'm doing it. And if I'm bringing this much value to you, maybe it should be more equitable. It's not a comfortable topic to bring up, but one area that you can is like, let's say they say, well, we can't do anything about salaries. Those are set by corporate. There's just nothing we can do. Well, what about benefits? If you don't already have flexible work days, maybe a little bit more flexibility could be a great value to you. Like if you have kids like myself, getting them to send you and pay for training and certifications. I mean, that could be tens of thousands of dollars in a year, especially if they send you to speak at conferences. I've got that situation with my current employer. They pay for me to fly out to speak at events, and that benefits them, but it also benefits me. If I want to find another position, that sure makes it a lot easier. So they need to make sure they take care of me as well. Any other benefits or other approaches towards negotiation that y'all would suggest? Oh, Gary mentioned illegal interview questions. Yeah, that'd be a good topic to be familiar with, is when are they pushing the line, or getting into territory that maybe shows you a character that you might not appreciate working with. Anybody else? As far as habits of being your own salesperson, I think if you do all the other things here, then you find you'll have the tools you need to have these conversations. Like you'll feel empowered. It will come more naturally to say, when you recognize I'm getting pinged by people for positions that pay more, but I really like where I'm at. What do I need to do about that? Well, I already have the narratives. I already have the brand. I already know what's available and where I can go and what I could do. I'm not saying to threaten to leave, but you're fully empowered now to have that conversation and to approach them. And maybe the habit is to set a check-in, like every few months, whether there's reviews or not. I want to meet with my leaders and have a conversation about where we're at. Are you getting what you need from me? Am I getting what I need from you? Let's make sure we're both good with this relationship. The last habit that we'll talk about, I'd say the bonus habit these days is using AI in your development process, but we're not going to get into that in this talk. Is not being afraid to take those risks and fail often and early. Now, when you think about whether you succeed or fail, like an entrepreneur, right? You entrepreneurs, either their business succeeds or their business fails. But what you find is for most people who rise to the top, that 1% of successful people, they fail a lot to get there. In fact, what you find is usually it's the people who are most well off, who can afford to fail a lot, that are the ones that are most successful, which makes it particularly hard for those who maybe come from poverty and don't have like the resources where they might get one solid shot. So getting in the habit of being able to try things and fail without it ruining your future opportunities is key. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing, I think the most important thing is to get out of your own way. Is to be realistic with yourself about what really happened, where your deficiencies lied, or what you should have done better. The term hedonic editing is where we go back in our mind and we say, well, it wasn't really my fault because this thing and that thing, and we make ourselves feel better by kind of tweaking the memories or how we perceive what happened. So I'm very much a stoic and a rationalist. I say, reality is what it is. Now, our perceptions matter, but truly understanding the reality of what happened and being honest with ourselves about it is power. Like that's the ability to learn and improve. And then, of course, being realistic about where that leaves you. Maybe I've invested a lot in Silverlight and I've become a really great Silverlight developer, and they're trying to sunset it. And am I going to maybe just say like, well, there's still a lot of Silverlight work out there. I'm just going to stick with it. Maybe it'll still catch on. Or do I cut my losses and say, yeah, the writing's on the wall. I need to, no matter how much I've invested in this path, it's just not the best path forward for me at this point. And creating safe spaces is probably one of the big ones I want to call out before we wrap up. Uh, if you think about your work environment and you think about the type of risks that you would need to take, maybe it's having a conversation about your compensation. If you feel like that's too much of a risk, like I could get fired just for asking about a raise or talking about compensation, then that's not a safe space to try and consider the possibility of failure. That may be an extreme example. Hopefully, the things you look at are smaller, like what about suggesting alternate ways to go about a solution? Am I going to get shut down? Is somebody's feelings going to get hurt? Whatever things you want to try, think about whether your environment is conducive to that. And then sometimes you can do something about that. You can prime the pump. You can say like, hey, I was thinking at the next team meeting, talk to your lead about like, I wanted to bring up an idea for how we could change our processes and get them in the right mindset to where when you do suggest that idea, it's not out of the blue or they don't feel attacked so both recognizing the limitations and the opportunities in your environment and realizing you can affect those, I think are the big factors. Let's see. Rajavendra said, one question I was asked in the review is if there's a package that I was recommending and another package being recommended by a coworker, how do I go about the recommendation process? Like, how do you reconcile the fact that you have a recommendation and they have a different one? And do you compare and contrast those? Do you consider the recommendation valid or are you dismissive of it? That sort of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it's more like the process, like they're expecting, like say if there's a PR and then there's a PR which requires a package and things like a NuGet package or something, and then I'm insisting on using a certain package, but another coworker suggests we use another package. So the question was more about like how do I go about recommending the package which I'm recommending? So like should I go about and check with the team and then say that most of the team members are fine with the package, so we go about using that package, and then like say if the team is like neutral, like what's the next step and things like that.
So I guess a lot of really great opportunities to showcase the communication and collaboration skills, ability to work with a team and consider different options and not let ego get in the way, but also maybe have some emotional intelligence about like maybe they're really committed to this option and how does everybody else feel about it? What's the sentiment of everybody?
Sure, yeah, that should be a finance. I try to do my best, but then again, there was one point say both like the team agrees with both of the packages and like what would you do? And then I went answering about saying, oh, we'll probably check with the team lead and then maybe check with the manager. If they're fine with the third package, I'm fine with that and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know.
I guess it's very situational. What was that, Sean?
I was going to say, I know in one of my talks too, I mentioned that we often find ourselves in a position in, like, for example, sales and marketing. I hate sales. I hate marketing. I'm not good at that. But sometimes we have to market and sell our ideas, our potential solutions either to clients or to coworkers on a team, things like that. Sometimes we're having to sell those ideas. And so sometimes we may say, well, we have to go beyond, well, this is what I suggest. Why? And so if you can spend some time ahead of time to, if there's opportunity for that and go and come up maybe proof of concepts, here's my understanding of it. This is why I trust this open source package. This is, I've looked into the source code. I don't see anything that's going to hurt the company, things like that. I've looked into the licensing about that. Then you're bringing that extra information to help sell that potential solution.
Excellent point. That's certainly a process we go through in the back end department in my company. Like leaders get together and talk about best practices and our internal framework. And when we say, well, what unit testing framework should we be using? it's not just about feelings and suggestions. It's about like, well, if you feel strongly about this, show us why it's the best solution. Create a little demo, walk us through it.
Sure, yeah. That was a very valid answer. I think, like in terms of trying to put my effort in trying to find out, like the, investigating about the source code, about the package, and kind of finding out like what future benefits it can bring to the project and the team, and trying to kind of convey it to the team, like what are the benefits of the package. I think that's like a really valid answer. I think it's more like as a developer, we kind of not kind of get chance to focus on the sales aspect of. We kind of I would say like mostly focus on the code and kind of get the things out kind of attitude. So I think these things for us as a developer, it's not easy to come, and these are some of the tricky questions I think we face during interviews, and it's good to learn from many people like you. Yeah.
You can think of it too, like if you've got coworkers that are trying to sell you on an opposing package, maybe something you already know you don't like, but they're trying to push that position. What would it take to convince you otherwise? Just as you're trying to sell one perspective, they're going to try to sell another. What would it take to convince you to change? And if you have that understanding of what would it take for you, you can turn that around and go, here's how I want to add that information to my sales pitch. And I hate sales. I hate trying to convince other people. But when we have the idea of like, I'm here to make the product better, I'm not here to win. And then, yeah, you're allowing yourself to have somebody else have their choice taken, but for the ultimate goal of bettering the product.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, this makes complete sense. Like trying to tell to the team like what are the benefits if we try to adapt the package, the other of the package, and what is the pain points and things. I completely agree. Yeah, I'll keep these things in mind so that in my next interviews, if I get such questions, I'll try to answer in the same context. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks.
It's a question, and frankly, to tie into that, as we talked about in this last area, I think getting in the habit of whether it's figuratively or physically looking at things from the same side of the table and saying, well, let's look at this together. Let's solve this problem together. You're like, we're not on opposing sides here. We're on the same side, but it's about evaluating options and figuring out the best solution. That's I think the best habit to get into, because then the taking risks and the failing early, like we're doing it together. This is a journey we're all going on. This is not about me versus you or any kind of opposition. Any other thoughts on habits that have allowed you to take risks, even not fear failure? But we're after 8. I think I've gone on for well over an hour now. So we can go and wrap up the actual presentation, but I'm happy to stick around and discuss. There's so much more on all these topics that's really fascinating. If you want to geek out about habits, or even if you want to get into AI development tools, I'd love to chat with you. And reach out to me if you want to schedule a meeting. You can go to meet.kergosien.net. Thanks.